So we are left with our last of the melee in this list. I left these four for last in a sort of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde style, because two of these specs have changed quite a bit in their possibilities of playstyle, whereas two other specs have remained nearly the same. Again, this depends entirely on your playstyle, whether or not you will enjoy the changes or not, so it's not necessarily good or necessarily bad. It's going to be up to you. The only melee spec that's left is Survival, which I will bump together with the last two ranged specs left after the second ranged video, which I will put out last. But first, let's start with these four melee specs, with the first one. First in line we have Assassination Rogue. Now, as already mentioned with Outlaw, Rogue has gotten the poisons back, has gotten Shiv back, and has gotten Ambush specifically for Assassination Rogue. Poisons are okay for Assassination, obviously, because they also scale with Assassination's mastery of poison damage. Shiv is also better for Assassination because Shiv also increases your nature damage on the target, so it works better for Assassination, as well as Ambush. The only changes in the entire talent tree for Assassination are that Toxic Blade has been removed, even though the job of Toxic Blade is now being done by Shiv, in favor of Alacrity, taken from the Outlaw tree for extra haste. And then Blindside has been reworked. Rather than being a ability in itself, it goes back to being a proc chance for your Ambush, since Ambush is back in the game. And a very increased proc chance on targets below 35% HP. This becomes a more viable execute buff to Assassination. Now, what's the problem though? These are very minor changes. Slice and Dice is also back, which I mentioned in the sub video. It's good for Subtlety because they have a passive that synergizes with auto attacks. It's good for Outlaw because they also have a passive that synergizes with auto attacks, but it's not good for Assassination, because all they do is proc poisons with their auto attacks and not much else, and it's not very strong, their poison damage. So what's the problem with Assassination? Well, this has been a very old school boomer style of spec, right? It is one of the slowest specs that requires the most pooling of energy and combo points. It is a spec that has very strong single target and very strong dot cleave on multiple targets, but they lack any sort of burst, they lack any sort of AoE or single target burst, they lack any sort of cleave burst, and they are also terrible at target switching because they need to reapply all their DOTs. This seems to have been engraved in stone, and when it comes to rogues, Blizzard has kept this very clear divide where Subtlety has very short burst windows and does mixed DOTs direct damage. Outlaw does very direct damage and lots of AoE and cleave, and Assassination does very stable single target damage. It seems like this is what Blizzard wants, and they will continue to do in Shadowlands. This is pretty much your experience as a rogue Assassination in Mythic Plus.
Too far away.
Yeah, it's very sad. Assassination has essentially 0 AoE still. No changes whatsoever on anything else in the talent tree, in the passives or anything. Covenants don't really help you. I mentioned it before. Echoing Reprimand for Kyrian is a very overcomplicated ability, and even if you manage to play it perfectly, all you're getting is 4 combo points, roughly, every 45 seconds on a finisher. And currently, the finisher that you benefit with extra combo points don't even scale with your several passives based on spending combo points, like Relentless Strikes, or Deepening Shadows, or Restless Blades, or Ruthlessness. So it's really confusing as a Covenant ability. The rated Bone Spike, as I mentioned before, is completely broken, but even if it gets tuned, it looks like it's going to be amongst the strongest, since it scales with the damage modifier of Vendetta, so it's still good. Sepsis, another lost opportunity for an extra dot for Assassination, since it's not poison damage and does not scale with your mastery, or Master Poisoner, or Shiv nature damage. So it's not very strong, and also doesn't really change the way you play. It just compounds on your DOT strengths, but no burst and no quick ramp up whatsoever with that. And Slaughter, I'm not even gonna show it because I mentioned it's fucking garbage. I actually played with Slaughter to try to see how bad it was on all 3 specs, and it's really bad, like really bad. When it comes to legendaries, lots of returns. Again, the baseline for all rogues is the 100% crit chance out of stealth. You have Doomblade, which is an extra help to single target damage, which is what you're already very good at. You have Dashing Scoundrel, which is extra poison damage and energy regen. Zoldyck Insignia from Legion Legendary, more execute. And Duststalker's Patch, which is, again, Legion Legendary, Vendetta cooldown reduction for single target, more single target. So yeah, there isn't really much else to say about Assassination Rogue. Literally the same as BFA. Very, very few changes. So if you enjoyed it, play it. If you hated that it was slow, if you hated that you needed to pull resources, if you hated that it didn't have AoE or burst, then stay away, because it hasn't really changed. Now we actually move to what I think is the most exciting melee spec coming in Shadowlands. Frost DK in BFA had the problem of being extremely mobile and also of having okay but unimpressive single target. They had extremely strong burst AoE and burst cleave and very good sustained AoE and cleave. The reason why I'm so excited about the potential of the spec is that two-handed Frost is back. I'm not a boomer or a hipster, I don't give a fuck about the flavor and the nostalgia of two-handed weapons on Frost. What I'm excited about is that Frost will now be able to change their playstyle based on the weapon they are using, which is like the first thing that happens in the game since like Alpha Decade. Because now dual wielding is going to be much stronger in AoE situations, more abilities used, more runic power generated and consumed, and a much stronger possibility to maintain Breath of Sindragosa, whereas two-handed weapon is going to be hitting much harder in single target. What's the changes? The changes are that Frostrune's Fury is now baseline. Essentially, your entire talent tree did not change, besides gaining another offensive cooldown, Hypothermic Presence, in exchange for Frostrune Fury being baseline. The biggest change of all the spec is that Killing Machine proc from your auto attacks to make your Obliterate free is now doing frost damage. This is massive because turning Obliterate damage from physical to frost is going to make you bypass armor, since it's magical damage. It's also going to make you scale your Obliterate with Mastery, which is massive because you're a Frost DK, your Mastery is frost damage. So it's a massive increase to Obliterate damage. On top of that, you use as a DK, your Runeforge for Frost is Razaris, which is 15% frost damage, which is also going to scale with Killing Machine Obliterate. On top of that, since you can use a two-handed weapon, you can also gain the passive Might of the Frozen Wastes, which is going to increase your Obliterate damage by 35% when you use a two-hander. So this clearly specializes your two-handed weapon build as a hard-hitting single target spec. Scaling talents are very well defined. There are some talents that scale better with a two-handed weapon because they scale only with your main hand. So if you are dual wielding, it's only going to count one of the weapons, but if you have a two-hander, it's going to count that entire weapon. Talents like Avalanche, Inexorable Assault, Frozen Pulse are all going to scale with your two-hander, whereas if you are dual wielding, you can go for, of course, Breath of Sindragosa, Hypothermic Presence, Runic Attenuation, Murderous Efficiency, things that give you more runic power, things that give you more proc chance. Because you are dual wielding, you have more chances to proc. It's gonna synergize better with your dual wielding style. So you have this very clear divide now between two-handed weapon, single target, dual wielding AoE. The reason why I'm excited is because usually when there is this possibility in a build coming in a new expansion, it's always like, yeah, well, Sims come out and option A is 30% better than option B, and option B becomes dead for the entire expansion. Like Demon Hunter possibility to play with Momentum, for example. Or back when rogues were trying to play with Exsanguinate and crit. You know, things that just die and are never used. In this case, the reason why this is so exciting as a potential differentiation between builds is that two-hander is specialized in single target and dual wielding is specialized in AoE. So it's very difficult that the dual wielding is going to overtake two-hander in single target. So it's gonna keep those builds viable throughout the expansion. That is the hope and the likely possibility, which would make this so more exciting. When it comes to Covenants, it's the same as Unholy. You have Shackled the Unworthy for Kyrian, which is single target based. You have Necrolord, Abomination Limb, which is again shit. Undertuned AoE ability. Let's do, it's a steroid for both single target and AoE. If you don't want to go too deep in AoE or too deep in single target with your Covenant, this is the perfect one, which is why DKs are so triggered, because you turn into a Fairy as a Death Knight, which is not very thematic. And lastly, you have Swarming Mist, which is for purely AoE. Very strong with dual wielding, who's already strong in AoE because it gives you massive runic power generation, which is super strong for Breath of Sindragosa. When it comes to legendaries, you have Koltira's Favor, which is extra damage with your Obliterate. Again, very strong for the single target build, and Absolute Zero. Halving the cooldown of Frostwind Fury is insane because it's a 3-minute cooldown. This is a 90-second cooldown discount, which is massive. Biting Cold, more AoE damage and AoE synergy with Remorseless Winter damage and guaranteed Rhyme proc as you use it. Again, extra help in AoE. And lastly, Rage of the Frozen Champion, which can be used by both builds, but likely better for dual wielding because you will get to use and cast more Obliterates as a dual wielding spec. Overall, the problem of mobility is still there. You still have very strong personals and defensives. Now you also have anti-magic zone, which is extremely good. But you now have the possibility to fix one of your weaknesses of damage profile. In BFA it was single target, and now you have the possibility, tuning permitting, to have a very strong single target build that you can swap in and out of compared to your AoE build and with dual wield weapons. I'm very excited to see how Frost DK continues the development into Shadowlands. So finally some good news. After so many specs saying and mentioning that they have remained the same, in Shadowlands there is a clear possibility for change here for Frost DK. The only tiniest complaint I would make is that now you're starting to get a little bit too many offensive cooldowns. Currently, you can have Breath of Sindragosa, your Covenant ability, Empowered Rune Weapon, Frostwind Fury, Hypothermic Presence, Pillar of Frost, and Remorseless Winter. We are talking 7, which is quite a lot. This is already was sort of the identity of Frost in BFA, where you literally had a longer offensive cooldown rotation that you had an actual ability rotation. It was very delicate trying to use your offensive cooldowns properly. They were a big part of your damage to use them properly, and now it's kind of becoming a little bit out of control. That's the only thing I would actually complain about. But for the rest, great looking spec so far. And now, from the revolutionary changes of Frost DK, we go back to the normality of Outlaw Rogue. Yeah, I'm disappointed because I didn't like the previous version of BFA, but if you enjoyed the BFA version, I can already spoil you. You're gonna be fine in Shadowlands. So, same changes for all other rogues. Slice and Dice is your new maintenance buff and no longer Roll the Bones. Roll the Bones is now a single cooldown ability to use every now and again. You get your poisons back. Again, click and forget. They don't really add anything to the build. You get Shiv, which, unlike Assassination, is not going to do anything for you. And the only big change is that you get a new talent. You lose Slice and Dice as a talent because it's baseline, and instead now you gain your artifact weapon power, Dreadblades. Now, what were the good things of Outlaw in BFA? Well, AoE and Cleave and Burst. Although Burst was slightly weakened compared to Legion version, they were still pretty good at Burst. What were the problems? Well, people getting triggered non-stop about Roll the Bones and the variance of the build, as well as the pretty average to bad single target damage. Coming into Shadowlands, some changes here and there, as I mentioned these ones already. The bigger one for Outlaw are of course that Roll the Bones is now no longer going to define your entire build, and that Between the Eyes is now being permanently moved into a damaging ability. Now all rogues have access to Kidney Shot as a stun finisher, and Blade Flurry has had his GCD justified by now having damage on activation. It's about a 4 combo point dispatch worth of damage when you activate it. Now, besides this, Outlaw Rogue has not really changed drastically compared to BFA. It still does the same thing. It still does have very good burst. Now you also have Dreadblades on top of Adrenaline Rush, and Restless Blades obviously can still reduce the cooldown of a lot of your abilities and, you know, big cooldowns. When it comes to legendaries, you have Celerity, which is a pretty good help especially will be a good help at the start of the expansion with the random procs of Adrenaline Rush to give you extra energy regen and just an extra help with your resource generation. Concealed Blunderbuss is an extra single target help, which is good because this is the weakness of Outlaw Rogue. Guile Charm is also possibly going to be very strong in single target when you can line up your cooldowns with your Sinister Strike, scaling up your damage up to 30%. You will be able to start your cooldowns at 20-ish% extra damage and cap out at 30%, which can be very strong. It can be strong in single target as well as AoE, but since your weakness is single target, that's what I would be more interested in. And lastly, we have the old coming back, Greenskin's Wickers. Between the eyes is going to have a 20% chance per combo points to increase the damage of your next pistol shot, which we have seen already. Now beyond this, everything remains the same. I'm gonna quickly repeat the same things for Assassination when it comes to Covenants. Serrated Bone Spike is still super overtuned and does tons of damage. Slaughter for Ventir is still an absolute joke. Echoing Reprimand is still way too complicated for the amount of benefit you actually gain from. And then Sepsis, even more so for Outlaw, is completely pointless. It doesn't even synergize with anything in your toolkit, not your mastery, not your cooldown reduction from Restless Blades, nothing. So it's just bad. Overall, you maintain the same strengths, insane, mobility and defensives, very strong AoE, cleave and burst. Some legendaries can help you with stronger single target, and the new talent can now give you even extra stronger burst. Besides that, your playstyle will stay the same and your strengths and weaknesses will stay the same. So if you enjoyed it in BFA, go ahead. If you didn't, you will likely still not enjoy it in Shadowlands. And now on to the last one of the other more interesting DPS specs coming into Shadowlands when it comes to changes. What was Fury Warrior like in BFA? Well, Fury Warrior had very strong single target, unparalleled execute phase. They had a very good mechanic to be able to do cleave and AoE without sacrificing their single target. They could splash AoE damage of their single target abilities after using Whirlwind, which is very strong because it means you don't have to spend Azerites or Corruptions or Legendaries or Talents into increasing your AoE abilities, because your AoE abilities are your single target abilities. Very, very mobile, pretty good, decent defensives, made even stronger in Shadowlands thanks to Ignore Pain being introduced and Spell Reflection. Now, what were the weaknesses? More than weaknesses for Fury, honestly, it was a matter of preference. The fact that every expansion Fury would become addicted to haste and to very, very high APM playstyle where you have to spam your buttons, and that it was also very starved when it did not have Enrage. And the only way to proc Enrage, you needed to use Rampage or to take a chance with Bloodthirst. This was particularly bad in Mythic Plus. When you finished a pack and you wanted to pull the next pack and you have 0 rage, as a Fury Warrior you were miserable. So these plethora of talent changes are going to help in several of these problems, especially the immobility of the talent tree. Plenty of talents were being used as a mandatory take for Fury Warriors. Carnage and Endless Rage were also a permapick, which have been removed completely. Sudden Death was also always taken. Now Sudden Death is in the same row of Fresh Meat, which is an incredibly strong Mythic Plus tool, much stronger than Sudden Death. This is extremely strong for a Mythic Plus, which gives you a legit option alongside Sudden Death. Massacre was another talent buffing your execute that was never taken because it was in the same row of Rampage. Now Massacre also reduces the cooldown of your execute by 1.5 seconds, which is also very strong. Several other small changes, as you see here, are all mostly good and just improve your options in your talent tree. When it comes to legendaries, they are rather basic. There's nothing, groundbreaking. You have Deathmaker, which has a chance to apply Siegebreaker when you use Rampage on your target, and Will of the Berserker, which gives you a flat 5% crit chance that you can keep up for the entire fight. Reckless Defense is yet another one of those use one of your rotation abilities to reduce your big cooldown. It's not particularly strong since Recklessness is not a very strong cooldown for Fury Warrior. And lastly, Cadence of Ujeda. 2% stacking haste whenever you Bloodthirst, stacking up to 4 times. This is, again, compounding on the haste playstyle of Fury. Fury right now can use Frenzy as a passive. Frenzy can now give you 9% haste. This legendary can give you another 8, and that's 17% haste. And then you get Enraged, and you get another 15, and that's 32% haste. You are borderline bloodlusted as a Fury Warrior at the start of the expansion. And that's a start of the expansion, Yeah, and when it comes to Covenants, You have Condemn, which is going to turn your Execute into an even stronger Execute because it's going to be doing shadow damage, meaning bypasses armor, which is extremely strong. Spear of Bastion for Kyrian is essentially the opposite. It's an AoE ability. Ancient Aftershock for Nightfey is a little bit undertuned at the moment, and by at the moment I mean the last 2 months. It has a longer cooldown than Spear of Bastion and does less AoE damage. And lastly, Conqueror's Banner, you know, the Cuckshed, the e-girl support. I don't think a Fury Warrior will ever take this. In closing, Fury does look really strong coming into Shadowlands, even just not just for the numbers, screw the numbers. The way it plays, the mechanics and the synergies in the new talents and the options you can have in the new talents, and several quality of life elements, particularly around the ease of proccing your Enrage and always having Enrage if you need to is going to be much stronger in Mythic Plus as well. They have remained strong in what they were strong. They didn't have any particular weakness in BFA, really, when it comes to damage profile. So overall, it's another spec that I look with very good optimism coming in the Shadowlands. And with this we're done with these 4 melee DPS specs. They were very clearly defined. Assassination and Outlaw received very few changes. They are mostly the same as BFA. A few quality of life improvements, but not much more. And then you had Frost DK and Fury Warrior with tons of changes, either in the way their abilities worked or in massive talents shuffles and quality of life improvements for both. Of course, there are still going to be sims coming, and we might know that every single one of those exciting changes are going to be useless and unplayable garbage, but for now we can hope those specs will get some choice in playstyle. So what's left now is the last 4 range DPS specs, and then we are left with the 3 leftover specs. The melee DPS leftover Black Sheep and the 2 range DPS Black Sheep, which I will leave for last because they drive me to suicide. So I want to delay that as long as possible. So if I survive overviewing those properly, you will see me very soon.